Good morning, everybody. Welcome to a new dawn, a new age. I see so many pundits and celebs and social media figures of various stripes proclaiming with such relief the past several years has been lifted finally from their chest and they can once again exhale. And my reaction to that is okay, yeah, the Trump experience was at times a rather heady one. But if you are that emotionally invested or emotionally incapacitated by the day to day minutia of national politics, you might want to consider whether perhaps your psyche, the composition of your personal nature, is what's at fault here. So I will grant that the frenzy at times since, I don't know, 2015, 2016 has been a lot, especially if it's your job or it's your main pursuit to follow it very closely. But at the same time, it does appear that a lot of people need to seriously consider detaching from the emotional furors of the national political scene. And if the ascendance of Joe Biden enables them to do that, I guess that's a positive. However, declarations of some new normal suddenly being upon us may be a tad premature. And this was made evident to me because I was in Washington. And I wasn't in the ceremony itself, obviously. That would have been almost impossible given the nature of the restrictions this year. I was there in 2017 at the inauguration itself. I was there in 2009, but not this year because, in part, Washington D.C. had been placed under military occupation. Seems sort of significant, and yet there were almost no questions raised, no skepticism leveled, no doubts proffered about the necessity or justifiability of imposing a military occupation on Washington, D.C. I mean, I'll be walking down the streets in one of these restricted areas and see just platoons of soldiers marching two by two in formation down the street. Who knows where they were going exactly? Who knows what the precise mission was at that point for that particular platoon? But you'd think that would arouse some interest on the part of the American media and others who have an interest in the functionality of our political system to, I don't know, maybe a little more critically analyze whether a bona fide military occupation was necessary. Clearly, at least the official line is that this necessity stems from what occurred at the Capitol on January 6th. But I guess I'll have to keep repeating this probably ad nauseum for the rest of my life. What had happened on January 6th was repressed and dispersed by agents of the state, lethal force in the actual Capitol building was a woman wearing a Trump banner who was shot dead at point blank range in the throat. So that was the one fatality that arose from armed lethal force in the Capitol building itself. At no point was there ever even the remotest risk that the government was going to be overthrown. Trump slinked away in disrepute almost immediately afterwards. He had initially pledged that he was going to join the marchers at the Capitol, and instead he went home and did what he normally does, which is watch TV and tweet. And then, he was unceremoniously basically banished from the public sphere, censored by a corporate crackdown, had to admit in humiliating fashion his defeat, and then couldn't even bring himself to utter the name of Joe Biden, his successor, or attend the inauguration, which was the first time that a president had not attended his successor's inauguration since 1869, when Andrew Johnson, who was also impeached, although not twice like Trump, that's Trump's sole distinction, when Johnson refused to attend the inauguration out of spite of his successor, Ulysses S. Grant. So that, to me, Trump's behavior from the aftermath of the January 6th goofball MAGA insurrection coup until January 20th did not bespeak some tyrannical determination to impose any kind of coup. In fact, he was probably the most meek and ineffectual of his entire presidency during that period, maybe just because he had a central communications mechanism for his entire time on as a national political figure. So I could see how that'd be a difficult adjustment. And then, we get to the pardons, and he decides to offer clemency to Lil Wayne, Kodak Black, Kwame Kilpatrick, Milligan, this Medicare scamming doctor who was a personal friend of Senator Robert Menendez of New Jersey and almost got Menendez himself convicted of felonies. Israeli spy, and a whole roster of sleazy officials, some of whom just gamed the system by paying lawyers who had access to Trump huge amounts of money, who could then lobby for pardons. Trump declined to pardon, although he had entertained it, apparently, reportedly, declined to offer any kind of clemency to Edward Snowden or Julian Assange. We have to wonder if the fact that Trump had his Twitter account deactivated made it so that he was unable to see the feedback coming from that venue across the ideological spectrum, imploring him to offer clemency to those two individuals, which you think he would have done if he actually had a good faith antagonism toward the supposed deep state. Because if anybody has really stuck it to the deep state recently, it's Snowden and Assange. But now, they are, Assange will be forced to continue withering away in semi-permanent exile in Russia. And Trump is hitting the links, as usual, playing golf in Florida. So the point is, given that conduct on Trump's part, where on January 6th, he almost immediately got spooked, told the mob to go home. The following day, confessed that he had been defeated. Did nothing that would suggest that he was trying to instigate some kind of insurrection or coup. In light of those facts, does it stand to reason that a military occupation of Washington, D.C. was truly necessary? I mean, I was there. You can go on my Twitter feed and see some photos and reportage. You had giant armored vehicles blocking off streets, National Guard directing traffic. I mean, you see that occasionally when there's a natural disaster and they're needed for emergency reasons. And I don't blame the individual soldiers. I had, friendly conversations with a number of them. Weirdly, every single one of them that I talked to happened to be from Pennsylvania, although there were deployments nationwide, but apparently a huge contingent from Pennsylvania. A couple of them were complaining to me about the price of chewing tobacco in Washington, D.C., as they were on their way to go find some because of the high taxes, at least relative to Pennsylvania. So they were perfectly, at least from what I could glean, amiable. The issue is not them on a personal level. The issue is whether the command from the higher ups was necessary, whether it was proportionate to the alleged threat. And the alleged threat itself hasn't really even been a week or in the days ahead of the inauguration saying that, oh my goodness, look out, not just for Washington, D.C., but all the 50 state capitals. They also have to militarize. So if you go around and look at what was done at the state capitals, they also erected massive barriers, had a military presence, massive law enforcement presence. And what happened? Well, in two of the biggest state capitals for the biggest states, Sacramento and Albany, a grand total of one Trump protester showed up at each. It was actually kind of sad. I mean, I kind of have to feel bad for them in a way. But there was no incident. There was no insurrection. There was no armed rebellion or seditious conspiracy. It all fizzled into nothingness. And does anybody have any accountability for that? Is anybody even bothered at all by that? By the way, how much did it cost taxpayers to place Washington, D.C. under military occupation? Will we ever get a price tag? Probably not, because now the Democrats control the House, the Senate, and the presidency, and I don't think they're going to be particularly interested in analyzing whether the nature of the purported threat that they were warning everybody about was really so grave that it warranted that kind of extreme action. And don't make no mistake about it, to use a politician type cliche, it was extreme. Go to if you were in Washington, D.C. or in the area and you happen to see it, you can attest. The place was shut down in the downtown corridor. On the Monday before the inauguration, I was able to walk to the closest as you could get to the National Mall, and they even added the flourish of, on top of the garish fencing apparatus, they adorned it with barbed wire. Now, what is the purpose of that? What is the purpose of adding the barbed wire? What kind of threat was that going to succeed in quelling? It was a show of force. It was a matter of deterrence. So you can argue that the whole thing was worth it because it deterred a threat. Well, but you can make that argument for any show of potentially unnecessary force if nothing turns out to happen. And as far as I know, the people who demanded that kind of show of force and screamed at everybody as to its undoubted necessity, they haven't even admitted that it was security theater. If you at least are honest and say that this was not so much proportionate to the alleged threat at hand, but it was a matter of security theater, then okay, at least you're semi-honest about what the point of it was. But we're not going to get that clarity, I wouldn't think. And so I was there. I spoke to, like I said, the National Guardsmen perfectly fine. They were walking around with rifles, massive rifles, conspicuously. And if you don't, I didn't immediately catch this because I'm not a gun enthusiast. But when I tweeted a photo, a lot of my commenters informed me, or at least drew my attention to the fact that their rifles were not loaded with magazines. So it wasn't as though if a threat suddenly popped up, they could then neutralize it by firing. Now, in peacetime, in non-war zones, if National Guard deployed, it's not wholly uncommon for them to walk around with the rifle strap but no magazine loaded. But still, it gives you some sense of how much of a threat that they were acting. Who knows who had political influence that they didn't even need to have their rifles loaded. And then on inauguration day, I was there. I was sort of on the outskirts. The Secret Service had checkpoints set up where they at least told people that you could get in and try to reach some level of proximity to the actual inauguration, but it was kind of a hoax. It was just a way to gather people together on lines that led to nowhere, and never even moved. And so it was like just kind of a bad faith endeavor on the whole. And now we hear the National Guard until mid-March is going to have 5,000 troops stationed in Washington, D.C. Is anybody going to ask whether the threat that was so frantically told to us existed, ever did really exist? Or are we all now in this constant posture of being told to be so immensely afraid of right-wing insurrectionary terrorists, or whatever the term is? I guess we'll have to see. And I did write a piece on this for Unheard. It's linked in the description box, so you can get some additional details. And those are my thoughts. It's amusing to me that so many in the media who declared with such certitude last summer that the mere prospect of deploying military force to quell civil unrest or to establish order in American cities, according to them, according to their moralistic proclamations, that was fascism. But then Washington, D.C. is placed under military occupation, and suddenly the presence of the military on American streets, and not just any American street, but the capital city, that's perfectly fine. That's anti-fascist or something. That's the kind of action we need to suppress fascism. And I don't think that any of them have really even bothered to interrogate an apparent discrepancy there. And that gives you some insight into what kind of consistency they're bringing to the table. All right, I do have a few super chats. Weston MJ says, love the hate you get on Twitter for being honest. Brunswick, Maine loves him too. Well, thank you to Brunswick, Maine. Look, if you have any kind of sizable platform on the internet, you got to expect that a lot of people are going to not take kindly to everything you say, especially if you are engaging in the controversial issues of the day. So I don't take that hatred personally, or at least I attempt not to the best of my ability as a sentient human. Neon says, should Baked Alaska have the book thrown at him? His raps are a crime against humanity. I haven't heard his raps. I am familiar with Baked Alaska. I understand that he was arrested. You could tell those guys were really committed, ideologically coherent insurrectionists because they all decided to live stream their commission of federal crimes. So they were definitely thinking clearly about what they were doing, and they were on the cusp of overthrowing the government and committing mass executions for sure. So Baked Alaska and a lot of these other people are in a world of trouble. This initial wave of arrests that we've seen since January 6th probably are much wider, more comprehensive conspiracy charges. So Baked Alaska could be, whatever he's charged with now, it could also be superseded with another indictment once the grand juries are convened and arrive at charges. And I would expect that to be even more likely now, given the shift in political circumstances with the Democratic government now in power, and Biden's administration promising, I think, next week to put forward some kind of plan to combat right-wing extremism. So we'll see what that portends for civil liberties. In all likelihood, nothing good. Somebody mentions the zip tie guy. Yeah, I mean, if you look at the actual court documents as opposed to media renderings of those documents, you'll find that prosecutors admitted in their appeal to have the guy who had the zip ties remain in custody. They noted that he didn't even come armed with zip ties to the Capitol. Once he burst in with the rest of the conspiracy-addled mob, he happened to cross some zip ties that were just lying around on a table somewhere and grabbed a few. And so that would militate, you'd think, against this idea that he had this premeditated kidnapping plan. Or at least that's the defense that you'd think would be employed by his lawyers should he be charged on some kind of sedition conspiracy. All right, everybody. Thank you. Unheard article, and soon. So, ta-ta.